think regardless of what David Letterman did, there was a period of time where she was intensely fixated upon him for her own delusional reasons. There was nothing that he could do to dissuade her.
Being married to David Letterman is much more palatable than being homeless with her children taken away from her.
David Letterman was their god, and Late Night with David Letterman was their church.
He made the error of mentioning her on his television program. By doing that, that's also then cementing her belief that he knows who she is.
Being depressed and bipolar, schizophrenic, everything stacked up against her, it just broke her down. She couldn't function anymore.
Her schizophrenia was entering into a different stage. It was becoming more dangerous, not only to herself now, but to other people.
Then after that, she fixated on Story Musgrave.
It's 2 or 3 a.m., it's in the middle of the morning, someone out there taking a shower with my host. She took it to a level at which I'm not comfortable and I don't understand.
Connecticut, 1993. David Letterman is the king of late-night TV, but with success comes visibility, and visibility can bring attention in an unwanted way. For Letterman, this attention comes from a mentally disturbed woman named Margaret Ray. She makes it her mission to get close to the comic by any means necessary.
She happened to go to a taping of his show, and while sitting in the audience, he was speaking to everybody there, and she fixated on him, thinking that they had a connection. She thought that he was talking directly to her.
Then her delusion took over, the delusion that she was married to David Letterman. And then her mission in life, the structure of her life, was all about seeking him out.
She became fixated, and that's when she couldn't tell fantasy from reality. She focused on him and thought that they were a couple, and she couldn't seem to get away from that fixation.
She started to stalk him and sending letters, found out where he lived, started showing up at his house, in fact, stole his car, his Porsche, and almost drove it over a cliff. The really scary part was that when the police stopped her, she had her 3-year-old son in the car too. So now she wasn't just endangering herself, she was endangering her family.
She got caught on a turnpike, could not pay the toll, and said she was Mrs. David Letterman, and this is his son. They had numerous run-ins. She would go to his house. She was found sleeping in his tennis court.
She broke into the house. He was in the bedroom with his girlfriend, and he looks up into the doorway, and she's standing there just staring at them.
How could a seemingly typical Midwestern girl come to stalk not one, but 2 celebrities, David Letterman and astronaut Story Musgrave? More than 4 decades earlier, Margaret Mary Ray, also known as Peggy, the woman who would become a punchline on late-night TV, is born in Grayslake, Illinois, northwest of Chicago.
Peggy Ray appears to have had the odds stacked against her from the very beginning. Her family must have been incredibly chaotic.
With Margaret Ray's case, her dad, her biological father, had schizophrenia before he was married.
Margaret's father, George Ray, works on machinery maintenance at a local factory, and mother Loretta is a nurse, but the family is doomed with a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia.
We know that schizophrenia affects about 1% of the world's population, but in families where there is a schizophrenic member, it's much, much higher. With Margaret Ray's case, the genetic loading for schizophrenia was passed down into the family.
I knew her family's history, which is devastating. They lost 2 brothers and a father to alcohol and suicide. You just take those 2 words and you have mental illness right there. So you knew there was trouble in the family and you didn't know where else it was going to go.
While her family is being torn apart with the suicides of her 2 brothers, Margaret is battling with her own demons.
Everyone in her family seemed to have difficulty functioning, including Peggy. The emergence of her symptoms are very typical. Sometimes in her late teens and early 20s, the family noticed odd behavior, bit bizarre, had trouble in school. And this is the prodromal stage, where the symptoms are beginning to emerge.
Schizophrenia has been described as a puzzle with missing pieces. The illness that is ravaging the Ray family is sadly one of the more difficult to treat.
People resist taking medication because they tell us that in the delusion, everything makes sense. With the medication and the emergence that the delusion is actually a delusion, they say that their life is then chaos, that if they stop taking their medication, they can go back to what makes sense for them.
It's 1947. A young Letterman is born into a stable, happy household.
David Letterman was born in Indianapolis. He was known as a geeky kid, but he used a lot of humor and sarcasm to get him through. That's why a lot of people liked him.
It seems to be a fairly typical, uneventful suburban upbringing for young Dave and his two sisters.
Dave was close to his dad. There was a relationship, but a lot of times he was working a lot. So he would, as a escape, Dave would watch TV at night. But David also said that his father was a comedian. They didn't have much, but there was always humor in the household. So his dad was always trying to make his family laugh.
By 1965, Dave takes on higher learning, enrolling in Ball State University.
I went to college at Ball State University, and that's when David Letterman and I met. Well, David Letterman, we know him as a TV personality. I knew him as a goofy college student way back when.
David Letterman, of course, is one of the most influential comedians of his generation, one of the most influential television hosts of his generation. He was in broadcasting pretty much his whole adult life. Started in college as a college radio guy.
While working on his degree in radio and television, Dave takes to the airwaves with a job at the college radio station WBST.
I was the production director and my brother was the program director. I think we were juniors and David was the new punk freshman who was starting. And I think we all said, who's this young punk guy? He had all this energy, you just felt like he had this stored up energy that he really wanted to do new and better things than we were allowed to do in college radio back then.
Letterman launches his own college radio show, Make It or Break It, in 1965.
He was really into radio. He would play records and it would be you would call in to see if you liked the record. If you didn't, he smashed the record. He would smash the record on air if you did not like the song that he was playing.
But Letterman's enthusiastic original approach isn't impressing everybody.
David was a real rebel. David always pushed the envelope. And college radio and Ball State radio, it was pretty staid and stuck to the script. So the director of radio and TV just finally didn't like it and said to Al, you got to get rid of this kid. And Al had to fire him.
This setback doesn't discourage Dave. In 1970, after finishing college, Letterman makes the jump from radio to the small screen, working as a local weatherman. But his offbeat jokes remain the same.
David Letterman was very bored with the idea of just presenting the weather. So he would go off script, he would warn people about errant weather phenomena that didn't exist. It was very unserious.
A woman struggling with genetic mental illness seems worlds apart from a comedic legend. Despite their differences, Margaret Ray's life will come to be defined by her all-encompassing obsession with David Letterman.
The isolation of having schizophrenia oftentimes can breed a very, very rich fantasy life that can lose its moorings and become delusional, where the delusional fantasy, the relationship with David Letterman, becomes the most important thing in her life.
In 1975, David Letterman moves to LA and is making the rounds at the city's comedy clubs.
David Letterman started performing at the Comedy Store on the Sunset Strip. At the time, it was the most important comedy club in California, maybe the most important comedy club in the world at the time. Letterman always wanted to be the MC in the comedy club. He always wanted to host, and all the comedians wondered, why would anybody want to be the host? So it was this sort of incredible foreshadowing to what he became.
Letterman is making a name for himself with his distinct comedy voice. He is clearly a star on the rise.
David Letterman's first big break is when he was on the Johnny Carson show, and he would do a few fill-ins. There was new blood coming in. So who is this guy, David Letterman? Who's this guy that's making me laugh?
When David made it on the Johnny Carson show, he was invited on and would do his bit. And then he was invited to sit down. And if you got a chance to sit down on the couch, then you made it.
Letterman quickly becomes a Carson favorite, going on to appear as a comic 22 times and a guest host 50 times.
He was so adept at hosting The Tonight Show that NBC and Fred Silverman, who was head of programming, thought, wow, we could maybe do something with this guy, maybe give him his own talk show.
Riding high off the success on Carson, in 1980, Letterman gets his own morning show, The David Letterman Show on NBC.
And so David Letterman suddenly comes to the air doing his David Letterman style of comedy, which in the 1980s was considered very weird, very offbeat, very subversive, and starts hosting a show in that time slot. And the viewership of that time slot didn't know what to make of it, and they didn't like it. They wanted high rollers, they wanted Wheel of Fortune, they wanted soap operas. They did not want Andy Kaufman coming on as a guest and doing really weird stuff.
The show is a critical smash, earning 2 Daytime Emmy Awards. Unfortunately, the critical acclaim doesn't translate into strong ratings.
Some of the biggest markets just refused to run it at all. They just showed game shows in its place because it was so unpopular.
Despite his emerging fear and self-doubt, Dave isn't down and out for long. In 1982, NBC bets on Dave again, and he premieres his new show, Late Night with David Letterman.
They revamped that template and that style for the late night time slot, debuted in 1982, and kind of revolutionized comedy in the 80s and influenced everybody that came later, from Norm Macdonald to Jimmy Kimmel to Conan O'Brien. They will all tell you David Letterman was their god, and Late Night with David Letterman was their church.
As Letterman is moving up the ranks in Hollywood, Margaret Ray is slipping deeper and deeper into a devastating mental illness.
Schizophrenia was pervasive among the siblings, including Margaret Ray being diagnosed with schizophrenia. First signs of them typically occur in late adolescence, early adulthood. We saw that with Margaret Ray, where she began to exhibit some signs of schizophrenia early on.
She then began to have her own symptoms, the withdrawal, the slowly developing this bizarre behavior and this disorganized thinking.
In 1972, Margaret drops out of nursing school at Marquette University. She marries and with her husband begins a nomadic life roaming the Midwest. The couple begins to have children right away and have 4 kids quickly over the next several years. They travel across America and eventually separate. Margaret takes the children to stay with her brother in New York City.
Margaret was a very close friend's sister. I knew her as a very beautiful, funny person. She was a caring and concerned mother with 4 young children when I first met her, and she was devoted to them, loved to bake for them and play with them, but also make sure they were doing their homework and going to school. And I think she knew that she had difficulties that I wasn't really aware of when I first met her, but they began to slowly emerge. But she was just a person trying to make her mark in the world as a good person.
In 1973, her brother Billy commits suicide. Just 4 years later, another brother, David, also takes his own life.
The suicide of the 2 brothers was violent. One of the brothers ran a car into a tree and killed himself. The other one asphyxiated himself. I think that the suicide of her 2 brothers in Margaret Ray's case would have implanted in her mind the hopelessness of a life with schizophrenia. I think the hell of schizophrenia is very difficult for people to grasp, but if you just think, for instance, about auditory hallucinations, what it would be like to have voices talking to you and then to look around and there's nobody there, or to have beliefs that you are adamantly convinced are true, and when you express them to other people, they look at you with disbelief, perhaps annoyance, confusion, and then they want to move away from you. So that both your senses and your thoughts, you can no longer trust.
With her increasingly disturbed delusional behavior, Margaret and her husband divorce, and a short time later he is awarded custody of their children. Despite the devastating loss, she will go on to have a fifth child.
Peggy Ray was frequently withdrawn. She had difficulty making and keeping friends. She had no social connections. She had bizarre behavior. At one point, she fed the family raw meat. She was seen wearing layers and layers of clothing on very hot days. This bizarre behavior and disorganized thinking led to a life where she couldn't support herself, she couldn't maintain a job, she couldn't maintain stable relationships at all. So Peggy's life in reality was she had her children taken away, she had no way to support herself, she was divorced from her husband, she didn't have a strong connection to her family of origin, but in her delusion, she was a very important person.
She would travel around the country. Her mode of transportation was riding with truckers. And she even had a handle. Her name was Lonesome Dove.
As her existence becomes more and more desperate, Margaret looks for validation and a more comfortable existence in her own misguided way.
Margaret Ray was younger than David Letterman when she pursued him. She pursued him over the course of 3 to 5 years. It appears that she was attempting to form a relationship with David Letterman. There is a very important component of what we call narcissism in these public figure stalking cases, where oftentimes there's the desire to get close to somebody who's famous, and then in a sense, part of that fame will rub off onto the stalker and they will gain some sense of infamous identity through their pursuit. And again, oftentimes the lives of these individuals are very blighted, they're very sad. They're very sorrowful. One of the most intriguing aspects of these public figure stalking cases is there's both danger and poignancy in the stories of these individuals.
She was out there all by herself. She lost everything. She lost her children, and she was all alone in the world.
With everything gone, it's only a matter of time before Margaret's unhealthy fixation on Letterman will dangerously fill this void. 1984, Late Night with David Letterman is breaking new comedic ground, earning a series of Emmy Awards and strong ratings.
Who are you? Why are you the only one with a microphone? Pass it around.
Anybody who was anybody was on that show. And if you made it to the David Letterman show, you'd made it.
The number of comedians who appeared on The Late Show with David Letterman doing their broadcast debut, who wouldn't have been doing what they were doing if not for having watched him on The Late Night Show, is tremendous. It's immense. You can't even count the number of people. He showcased them first as stand-ups, and later when they became stars, they were welcome guests. There's all kinds of people working comedy clubs today who can use it as a credit and make a living.
Letterman was succeeding with his own inventive style of comedy, debuting the top 10 list in 1985. The segment goes on to be a staple for the rest of his career.
NBC saw David Letterman's growth and saw what he could become, and thank God they believed in him, because the ratings don't lie, numbers don't lie. People were watching him to see what he's gonna do next.
Letterman was like a hip young guy, you know? And he would take things apart. He was sort of, and I'm sure he would hate this description, but he was sort of the punk rock of comedy for its era. In the 1980s especially, he had little to no respect for authority. And having little to no respect for authority is something that speaks to comedians and comedy fans, because ultimately, that's what we love seeing, is a comedian puncture pomposity, tear down the authority figure, and tell them to go themselves.
Dave quickly becomes a fixture of late-night TV. His show airs right after Carson and is a must-see around the country.
Entertain me, Dave. Like, I went through a hard day's work, so your job entertain me. And they came back every single night.
Letterman is flying high and amassing fans, one of which he will soon come to know more than any other, Margaret Ray, also known as Peggy.
Peggy Ray's story is very typical of someone with schizophrenia.
They can pose a threat, but on the other side of that, they can tug at your heartstrings.
She would stay with people for short periods of time, help them clean a house or whatever, but she had a nomadic spirit. She didn't like staying in any place for any length of time, and at any given time, she would just up and go.
In 1984, Margaret is still battling the demons of schizophrenia. She gives birth to her 5th child, a son. Nobody knows who the father is. Despite experiencing the ravages of schizophrenia, Margaret doesn't get help or take medication with any consistency.
With schizophrenia, there's good medical treatment, there's good medications. If people are compliant with taking their medications, and in some cases, if they can put up with the side effects. In Margaret Ray's case, we saw a medical approach to her not work very well.
In the late 80s, Margaret begins to become infatuated with David Letterman after attending a taping of his show. She sends him letters and becomes convinced they have a relationship.
As her symptoms emerged, then she became fixated upon him, and her delusion was then built around him, almost as if she had a date with him every night, and it became more of a personal connection. So as the boundaries between reality and fantasy started to blur for her in her early and mid-20s, he became what was real for her, and the delusion was built around her being his wife.
If an individual appears on television on a repetitive basis, we know now that they're more likely to attract stalkers.
In May 1988, the Letterman obsession keeps escalating. Somehow she tracks down his Connecticut address and steals his Porsche. She is driving near the Lincoln Tunnel when she is pulled over for failing to pay a $3 toll. She tells authorities she is Letterman's wife, and her 3-year-old son in the car is actually his son.
In being David Letterman's wife, that created for her something that was not just about hope, but it was about purpose.
We see this in psychotic individuals that will pursue public figures, believing that they have a special relationship, that they actually believe that this other person is in love with them, and that shared affection is very much a real thing, when in fact it's not.
1 year after the stolen car incident, Margaret gives her son to her mother and brother to raise. She is incapable of taking care of herself, let alone a small child. This sad development doesn't dissuade her from continuing her pursuit of Letterman. She breaks into his house twice, just days apart. Letterman calls Margaret's appearances at his home more odd than alarming. Margaret is found unfit to stand trial and sentenced to time in a mental hospital.
Thank you. So grateful the media showed up. Although I'm a week ahead of schedule according to the papers that were sent to me in jail.
It's not unusual that you see this type of persistence in going back to the location on several occasions. The thing we have to remember that this is a thought disorder.
In the case of Peggy Ray, we don't know that her seeking out David Letterman was inherently threatening or that she meant to do him harm in any way. The problem with stalking is that it's based on a delusion. It's based on a false belief. And because that delusion has so many unknowns in it, only the person could tell us what their plans are. That's what makes them dangerous.
It's the early 1990s in New Canaan, Connecticut. David Letterman continues to entertain millions on a nightly basis with The Late Show, but in his private life, he is attempting to manage the unwanted and troublesome attention from his stalker, Margaret Ray.
In the case of Peggy Ray, we don't know why she chose David Letterman. It could have been simply she enjoyed the show and she watched it every night.
She certainly engaged in behaviors that were affectional toward David Letterman, and to my knowledge, did not ever utter a dangerous threat or engage in any aggressive or hostile action toward him.
Over the next few years, Margaret becomes a fixture at Letterman's Connecticut mansion. She's found on the property or in the immediate neighborhood more than a dozen times. She is in and out of prison and mental hospitals.
Whoa. I haven't seen a comb in 5 days.
She liked the attention, but I don't think she really realized the intensity of the attention or the type of attention she was getting. I think she was kind of like a moth to a flame, that it consumed her.
Part of the tragedy of the Margaret Ray case is she would do things that would get a lot of media attention, and you see the public oftentimes being entertained by the details of an essentially tragic and very sad case.
She could never get away from what she'd been labeled or who she was. The problem is, Margaret, she could not see her kids, and she really had no connection with anything. So she had a connection and a fixation with David Letterman, and I think it might have tried to fulfill something in her where she had a connection with somebody.
One time she left cookies and an empty bottle of liquor in his foyer. He was aware of this going on, and he wasn't scared, he said. He just found her behavior to be really odd. She was smart. She was so smart and so convincing that while she was on the property at David Letterman's house, there were painters, and she convinced the painters that she was Mrs. David Letterman and talked them into giving her a ride into town.
During this time, Letterman is under intense media attention. Johnny Carson announces he is retiring from The Tonight Show. Now the speculation begins as to who replaces him on the legendary program. Dave or fellow comedian Jay Leno.
Now, Letterman originally had been touted as a possible Johnny Carson replacement as early as 1980 when Carson was having a contract dispute with the network. They said, well, we kind of have this card in our back pocket that we could play if necessary. David Letterman, he could possibly take over. So that seed had been planted in Letterman's mind even before he had Late Night with David Letterman. So NBC decided ultimately Letterman wasn't a company man, even though he'd been under contract to NBC for short of 20 years. So they went with Jay Leno. And it did not sit that well with Letterman.
In response to the snub by NBC, Letterman moves his show to CBS, and it is renamed The Late Show with David Letterman. But the unwanted attention of Margaret Ray is never far from his mind.
So Letterman did this top 10 list, the top 10 things I have to do before I leave NBC, and one of them was to send a change of address card to the woman who breaks into his house. One of the only times, I guess, that he referenced the stalker on his program.
Despite the jokes, Letterman is very sympathetic to Ray's ongoing battle with schizophrenia.
You also see it in his response to her case, that he really showed empathy, whether it was in court or whether it was on television. And other people commented on that too, that I think he felt sadness for her rather than fear or anger toward her.
But for Ray, empathy can only go so far. The case reaches a pinnacle in 1993 when Margaret takes things too far.
The only time that he actually expressed fear was when she showed up in his hallway. And he was there with his girlfriend at the time, and she had just entered the house.
He was in the bedroom with his girlfriend, and he looks up into the doorway, and she's standing there just staring at them. And that frightened him. He had refused to prosecute in the past, but at this point, when he found her at his bedroom door, with everything else going on, he felt he needed to step forward and prosecute.
People were scared of her, which is understandable because, if somebody is constantly coming into your space and invading your space and you can't get them out of your space, you don't know what their intent is.
As a response to Ray's persistent stalking of Letterman, the state of Connecticut passes anti-stalking legislation in 1993.
Because of her behavior, because people were aware of stalkers, that's one of the reasons why Connecticut wound up getting a stalking law.
In all, Margaret spends 10 months in prison and more than a year in state mental facilities. She's given a cold, hard dose of reality and may be finally moving on from Letterman.
Well, the fascinating thing about this case is when she got out, usually stalkers go back to where they started from, the same victims. And in this particular case, she fixated now on somebody completely different.
She was told through the criminal justice system that she could not seek out David Letterman, and somehow in her mind, the delusion made sense of that and justified it for her, but then it shifted to yet another person of high status.
The need there, again, I think, is driven by pathological narcissism. When you are depleted, when you are alone and you are lonesome, you can compensate for that by going into this fantasy world.
In 1994, shortly after Ray's latest prison stint, astronaut Story Musgrave is garnering national attention for successfully repairing the Hubble telescope. Around NASA, he is the man for his expertise and extensive space travel.
I did Challenger's first flight. I did the first shuttle spacewalk in the history of the shuttle program, but why? Because that's what I do in life.
Soon, Story becomes the target of a bizarre series of correspondence.
I got the first letter and I said, oh my goodness, this is the most creative, brilliant thing. This letter is outrageous. I don't know who it's from, and so there is no author on it. But I perceived that this is brilliance and it's genius and it's a lovely piece of work, and so I kept it. More letters came. More letters, and they're of the same unbelievable quality.
And she would send him cards and letters. And eventually she ended up going to Johnson Space Center, and she said that she was a reporter. And she worked for a college newspaper.
In an attempt to get closer to Story, Ray goes through great efforts to arrange an in-person interview with him, posing as a journalist. During their interview, Story is completely unaware that the woman sitting in front of him is the same woman sending him all the letters and artwork.
But obviously, first impression is she's been traveling, and she's hitchhiking, and she probably spent the night sleeping on the grass or something out there. I don't know, but she was marvelous to talk to. She's just terrific. She doesn't want a story, she wants to talk to me. She was very pleasant to talk to.
Story's perplexed by this strange interview from a woman who is clearly not a journalist. What was she doing there? What did she want from him?
And so, I had the interview, but then I got a letter from her, and it was her, with her signature, and here's the letter. Okay, so now it's very clear. All the letters I got in the past were from this lady I had to interview with. It's totally clear, here it is.
She ended up clipping newspaper articles, and she had candles, and it was like she had a little shrine in this cabin, and Margaret was starting to go down that same path again that she traveled with David Letterman.
When you have mental illness, you can't expect us to do the right things. But I guess she arrived at the end of the road, and that was it.
In 1994, following years of stalking late show host David Letterman, Margaret Ray has set her sights on NASA astronaut Story Musgrave.
She saw him on the news when he was in orbit with the space station. He was also repairing the Hubble telescope. And she was just amazed that this man could perform and do these things. And she became very fixated and delusional, and she thought he had a connection with her.
So more women are represented when it comes to a public figure pursuit. Typically, when women pursue as a stalker, they will pursue an older man. And when men pursue a victim, they will typically pursue a younger victim. So it has the same gender age dynamic as you see in normal relationships in society.
After her visit to the Johnson Space Center to interview Musgrave, Margaret resumes her nomadic lifestyle, bouncing from one town, one state to the next. But soon, her letter-writing campaign isn't enough, and she makes the trip to Florida to Story's house.
Well, it's 2 or 3 a.m., it's in the middle of the morning, someone out there taking a shower with my hose. So that's all I got. So I need to do something with this, but I don't know what I'm dealing with.
Story is on high alert. Is this a burglar, or someone coming to harm him? He quickly sneaks outside to assess the situation.
I don't know what I'm dealing with, but I need to protect myself, so behind a tree and ready to take what evasive I need, I let out this animal shriek. And I know how to shriek. And you don't want me shrieking in the middle of the night, because it's going to scare you beyond. And she screamed.
Story's mind quickly flashes back to the bizarre interviews at the Johnson Space Center. He quickly realizes the woman taking a shower with his hose is the same woman who posed as a journalist to get to him.
I knew that was Margaret Ray as soon as she screamed. If she came out and said, Story, you know, I'm sorry to trouble you in the middle of the night and I'll leave, you know, I would have left it alone. She took it to a level at which I'm not comfortable and I don't understand. It's 3 in the morning and we're uninvited, and I don't know what's next. I don't know how to handle this. I just call the police. That's all I can do. I haven't seen Margaret since.
Margaret is taken to Osceola County Jail and charged with stalking. She will also be charged with assault on a correctional officer after spitting in his face.
Ms. Ray actually, in one of her court proceedings, was being brought up to court on the stalking charge and spit at a deputy sheriff who was a corrections officer at the time and got charged with battery on a correctional officer. From that time, they had her wear a mask because they were afraid she was going to spit on other deputies and other court personnel.
Thank you. So grateful the media showed up. Although I'm a week ahead of schedule according to the papers that were sent to me in jail.
So she ended up spending almost a year in Osceola County Jail. And while she was there, the correctional people had a way of provoking her to make her mad. They would push buttons that would provoke her, and then she ended up spitting in the eye of one of the correctional officers, which ended up being battery. So she had been released for time served, but then she still had a battery charge.
Mental health and incarceration are so intertwined and so devastating to society and to, of course, to the people who are directly affected. Broken families, poverty, drug use, all of the above. And when you start with a celebrity stalker and end up thinking about this in this way, that's why it's important. Beyond just the reputation and the integrity of one individual who has failed.
Margaret Mary Ray was found competent to stand trial, which allowed her to enter pleas to both the stalking charge and the battery on a correctional officer.
All right, I don't want to ignore something here. Do you understand?
The court proceedings for Margaret Mary Ray was sometimes very chaotic because she would say things in court which were turned outbursts.
Oh, no. You're not sending me back to that jail. I have hospital rights. I am not going back to that dump.
Her sentence was 11 months with credit for time served. At the time, she had 276 days in the county jail. We basically worked out a time served plea.
While in prison, Margaret befriends a local woman who will turn out to be one of the last people who ever hears from her.
My girlfriend had been incarcerated for failure to pay child support. She was having a very difficult time. She just couldn't deal with being in jail. And Margaret befriended her. You know, she didn't know her from Adam, but she was there for moral support. And they became friends. She really helped her through a difficult time. Margaret was released from the correctional facility, and she had nowhere to go. The problem was her options were limited, so we let her come stay with us in my house in St. Cloud, and she was actually very nice. The perception that people have of her is actually totally wrong. The only time she had any kind of issues is when she got off her medication. So when she came to live with us, she was very nice, very jovial. She had a good sense of humor. And the first night we went out, we had Chinese food. And we went to an American Legion and had a few drinks and danced to Patsy Cline. And it was just like going out with normal people.
Margaret is enjoying a bit of normalcy amongst friends, but after a few weeks with Jeff and Terry, she stops taking the medication prescribed to her while she was in prison.
Well, there's two different sides to Margaret. You know, there's the medicated Margaret, which means that she is jovial, good sense of humor, very intelligent, nice to be around. And every time that there was any kind of outburst with Margaret is when she was off her medication. Problem is, whose responsibility is it to make sure that she takes that medication? You know, and then who pays for the medication, and where does she go when she's taking the medication? And the bad thing is the world's full of Margarets. She was with us for probably 3 or 4 weeks, and her nomadic spirit kicked in, and she wanted to go see her kids. So what we did is we gave her some traveling money, and we took her to a truck stop in Orlando. And she went to one trucker and asked for a ride, and he said no. And then went to another one, and he nodded his head yes. And she got up in the cab, and away they went.
Margaret makes the trip to Colorado, where she stores her few possessions on a friend's property. She's hoping to rebuild her broken family, but just a few weeks after she leaves Florida, Jeff Rassler gets a call from her.
And she said, I'm coming back to Florida. I was just kind of dumbfounded, and I said, well, Margaret, why are you coming to Florida? And there was a pause, and she said, oh, you don't want, I can't stay with you? And I said, no, Margaret, you really need, the whole purpose of sending you to Colorado was so you could reestablish yourself with your family. Oh, okay. Well, just tell Terry that I called, and then I didn't hear anything else about Margaret until a few days later, a friend of mine called and says, hey, you know that lady that was staying with you? She laid down in front of a train and killed herself. And I was, I didn't know what to say. A few days later, I happened to see a package that had come from Margaret, and she had sent her suicide note to us. She also sent letters to her kids, her mother, and she basically she lost the will to live. Dear Terry, please forgive me for not repaying you and what I owe you and Jeff. I have been very depressed and decided to take my life while the taking was good. There just isn't anything left that I want to do or be a part of. I don't know if my death will be broadcast or not, but I hope you will not take it too hard. I'm all traveled out, and the thought of being idle for some time leaves me with no will to live, zero. My handwriting has deteriorated, and so have I. I don't wish to continue life as I know it. A train will do.
Letterman addresses the suicide of his serial stalker. He releases a one-sentence statement that reads, "This is a sad ending to a confused life."
I'm not surprised at all that she committed suicide. It's very important to recognize in a sense, the tragedy and the horror of schizophrenia. This is a brain-based, very catastrophic psychiatric disorder. It creates oftentimes hell for the individual, as well as for other people around them, including their family members, siblings, and parents.
She seemed to be very tortured, very tormented by her thoughts and feelings and her inability to maintain some kind of control over her life.
I think over a period of time, all the traveling and everything that she dealt with, all the attention, all the media attention, it just broke her.
This is a tragedy that could have been prevented if she had gotten proper therapy, if she had taken medication, if she had someone watching over her. But none of that happened, and instead she decided to just end her life throwing herself in front of a train.
When I heard of her death, it made me angry, that she was so alone.
I think the problem was with Margaret is when she was stalking people, she was trying to fulfill a need. She had nothing in her life, and being attracted to these people helped fulfill something to help ground her and make her feel that she existed. She had something.
Well, I guess she arrived at the end of the road, and that was it. But I was distressed and incredibly sad that was the outcome. A brilliant, gentle lady who needed help.